Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Fuchs, and for my project, I examined wholesale versus property by property theories in third language acquisition of Brazilian Portuguese under the supervision of Dr. Victoria Mateo. Various hypotheses posit how adults acquire a third language, and some of the key ones are mentioned here. The lower two are the ones that have been proposed most recently, and the ones that I examined with more depth. The typological primacy model predicts that whichever language is more typologically similar to the third language, whether it be the first or second, will be initially transferred entirely in a wholesale fashion to assist adults' third language acquisition. Meanwhile, the linguistic proximity model argues that transfer is not confined to just one language. Instead, individual properties within each language can be transferred, which can either help or hurt the learner's third language acquisition. In this study, we examined adults who are learning Brazilian Portuguese, also known as BP, as a third language with English and Spanish backgrounds, and compared them to those without a Spanish background. The goal of this study is to examine whether the predictions of the TPM or LPM hold. The typological primacy model would predict a wholesale transfer from Spanish during the early stages of learning BP because it is typologically more similar to BP, while the linguistic proximity model would predict that specific properties of English may also transfer during these early stages. To compare the two hypotheses, we will be examining two test conditions in blue: differential object marking, as well as auxiliary VP ellipsis. We will also be examining two control conditions in white: prepositions before inanimate direct objects, as well as modal VP ellipsis, and I will provide an overview of each condition in the following slides. The first test property or test condition is called differential object marking. This is a property that is present in Spanish, but not English or BP. Direct objects that are animate and specific must be preceded by the preposition a. We can see its conditions in the following sentences. In the Spanish sentence, we have the marker because a specific girl is being searched for. Also, it is important to know that if you see an asterisk in a sentence, it refers to something that is ungrammatical. Though this preposition is permitted in Spanish before animate and specific direct objects, in all three languages, prepositions before direct objects that are inanimate are impossible, as can be seen in the translations of the following sentence, a sentence that was used in our study. Our next property is called auxiliary VP ellipsis. This property is allowed in BP and English and refers to what we see in the English sentence below. Here, it is not necessary to repeat seen Lee a second time because after the negated auxiliary has not, we can infer what the elided verb phrase is, and BP behaves the same. However, in Spanish, the phrase would have to be repeated. This applies to auxiliary verbs such as be or have. However, a similar property, called modal VP ellipsis, is allowed in all three languages. This describes the previous structure, but with modal verbs, such as can or could, being stranded. In all three languages, the verb phrase such as see Lee does not need to be repeated after could. Here we have predictions by condition for each hypothesis. Starting with our control conditions, both hypotheses predict that participants will correctly reject prepositions before inanimate direct objects by giving them low ratings because none of the languages tested allow this. Conversely, both predict that the participants will correctly accept sentences with modal VP ellipsis because all three languages allow it. These control conditions ensure that participants are paying attention to the sentences and can assess them as ungrammatical or grammatical as needed. Participants that didn't perform as expected in the English control conditions were excluded from this study. For experimental conditions, the models predict two separate outcomes. For differential object marking, the TPM predicts that there will be a negative transfer from Spanish, meaning that participants will incorrectly rate sentences with DOM in Portuguese as high, because that's what should be done in Spanish, and that those with Spanish in their background will perform worse than those without Spanish. On the other hand, the LPM anticipates that participants will correctly give low scores to these sentences because that is what English expects. With this hypothesis, we do not expect a difference between those that do have Spanish in their backgrounds and those that do not. Our other test condition is auxiliary VP ellipsis. Here, the TPM predicts that Spanish speakers will poorly rate sentences in Portuguese with this ellipsis because it is not allowed in Spanish, while those that do not speak Spanish will perform better by giving these sentences higher ratings in BP. This is because Spanish is not a potential negative factor in their acquisition of BP, and by now they're assumed to see English as more similar to BP in elided structures. To test this, we had 12 participants. 8 speak English and Spanish, then learned BP, and 4 spoke English, then started learning BP without any Spanish background. These groups had been studying BP for about 1.5 to 2 years with an average of 2 to 3 classes taken, and were beginning intermediate students. This is an ongoing project, so because our sample size is small for now, we will only discuss trends instead of formal statistical analyses. The participants completed an acceptability judgment task in the languages that they knew, so that would be either 2 or 3, depending on whether they spoke Spanish. On a Google form, they assessed how natural 20 sentences sounded in each language on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 meaning very unnatural and 5 meaning very natural. In each language, 5 sentences were dedicated to the 4 conditions, and these were our results. I will first discuss differential object marking, the experimental condition, as well as prepositions before inanimate direct objects, a control condition. With the control, we expected this to be rejected in all 3 languages, and it thus received low numbers. The ratings in Spanish and BP are higher than we expected, but this is likely to due to participants not being either native or dominant in Spanish or BP. Crucially, for DOM, participants rejected this in English as expected. Those that spoke Spanish rated these highly, which is also to be expected because this is required in Spanish. The Spanish speakers gave BP sentences in DOM an average rating of 3.05. However, in BP, we see that they did not rate the DOM higher than the preposition control condition, which would be expected if there is Spanish wholesale transfer. Moreover, they rated the sentences over a point lower than those in Spanish, suggesting that they do not fully apply Spanish rules to BP in a wholesale fashion. Lastly, those that do not speak Spanish did not rate these sentences significantly lower than those that do speak Spanish, showing again that Spanish is not significantly transferring to the L3. Moving on to ellipsis, our experimental condition was auxiliary ellipsis, while our control was modal ellipsis. With modal ellipsis, we expected high ratings in all 3 languages in both groups because it is permitted in all 3. The ratings in Spanish and BP are lower than we expected, but again, this may be due to the fact that they are not native or dominant speakers of Spanish or BP. Crucially, for auxiliary VP ellipsis, both groups accepted this in English as expected, with values that are close to 5. Those that spoke Spanish rated these low in Spanish with an average score of 1.85, which is also to be expected because this is not permitted in Spanish. However, in BP, we see that Spanish speakers did not rate auxiliary VP ellipsis significantly lower than the modal VP ellipsis. There is only a small difference between 3.0 and 3.68. If Spanish transferred in a wholesale fashion to BP, we would anticipate a more substantial difference whereby the value of 3 would be here in bold, would be closer to the value in pink. They rated the sentences over a point higher than those in Spanish, suggesting that they do not fully apply Spanish rules to BP. Moreover, the participants without Spanish also rated auxiliary VP ellipsis rather high, as seen in orange, showing again that Spanish wholesale transfer cannot account for this pattern of results. For our discussion, when we look at our 2 experimental conditions, differential object marking and VP ellipsis licensed by an auxiliary verb, we can conclude that there is no wholesale transfer from Spanish among our Spanish-speaking participants. They rated the DOM in Portuguese lower and sentences with auxiliary ellipsis in Portuguese higher than they would in Spanish. As for the goal of this study, which was to compare whether the TPM or LPM holds in third language acquisition of BP, our results do not fully align with the TPM because Spanish did not showcase a wholesale transfer to properties that it does not share with BP. That said, our results do not provide proof that for the LPM either because the ratings given to the properties that English and BP share were not close. To summarize, we concluded that our results do not align with the predictions of the TPM, nor can they provide proof for the LPM.